The stars had always been quiet. For most of human history, people looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. They sent radio signals into the dark. They built giant listening dishes and pointed them at distant stars. They waited. For a long time, nothing answered. Then, in the year 2079, everything changed. A small probe sent to the edge of the solar system picked up a weak signal. It was not from a natural source. It was not a pulsar or a dying star. It was structured, yet repeating, and clearly made by something intelligent. Within 72 hours, every major government on Earth knew about it. Within a week, the world knew. Humanity was not alone. The next decade was chaotic. Governments argued, scientists translated, diplomats practiced speaking into the void. And slowly, carefully, the first conversations began between Earth and the wider galaxy. What humanity found out there was not what the old science fiction movies had promised. There were no friendly aliens with glowing fingers offering peace and wisdom. The galaxy was old, complicated, and deeply political. There were hundreds of civilizations out among the stars, and most of them had been watching Earth for a long time without saying a word. The group that finally made contact was called the Galactic Conclave. It was a council of over 200 alien species spread across thousands of star systems. Some of them had been traveling between stars for millions of years. Some had technology that made human science look like cave paintings. They were polite, organized, and very clear about one thing. Humanity was new. Humanity was small, and humanity should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Earth accepted the terms. Humanity joined the conclave as a junior member, which meant they had the right to speak, but not the right to vote on anything important. They were given access to basic star maps, basic trade routes, and very basic medical technology. The conclave kept its most advanced knowledge locked away, reserved for older and more trusted species. Still, humanity moved fast. By 2120, humans had built their first real starships. By 2140, they had small colonies on 3 planets outside the solar system. By 2187, there were over 40 million humans living among the stars, spread across Mars, the asteroid belt, several moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and 3 colony worlds in nearby star systems. The conclave still called them the young ones. Most alien species found humans to be strange. They were too emotional. They made decisions based on feelings and not just logic. They laughed at things that weren't funny. They cried at things that didn't matter. They got attached to objects and animals and places. They named their ships after dead people in old myths. And they seemed to carry the weight of their entire history on their shoulders at all times. But they were also productive, harder working than many older species expected, and they were very, very good at learning. Admiral Serena Voss was one of the best examples of what humanity could produce when it tried. She was 53 years old with short gray hair and eyes that always looked like they were calculating something. She had spent 30 years in the United Earth Defense Command, in which everyone simply called the UEDC. She had fought in 2 small border conflicts near the outer colonies. She had negotiated with alien merchants, alien pirates, and alien government officials who thought humans were barely worth their time. She had never once backed down from anything. On a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2187, Admiral Voss was sitting in her office aboard the UEDC command station orbiting Earth when her communications officer knocked on the door and came in with a look on his face that she had never seen before. His name was Lieutenant Yusuf Marin, and he was 26 years old and normally very calm. Right now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. She told him to sit down and talk. He placed a data tablet on her desk. On it was a readout from the Oort Cloud Listening Network, a system of deep space sensors that humanity had built quietly over the past 30 years along the very outer edge of the solar system. The network was not advertised to the conclave. Most of its existence was classified. The readout showed an energy signature, a massive one, moving at nearly 40% of the speed of light, coming from the direction of the outer veil, which was a region of space past the known conclave territories where very few civilizations lived. Voss studied the data for a long time without speaking. Then she asked him what the formation looked like. He told her the signature wasn't one ship. It wasn't a fleet of 10 or 20. The formation analysis showed a spread consistent with thousands of individual vessels moving in a coordinated military advance pattern. The computer had been running calculations for 3 hours before Marin brought it to her because it kept rejecting the results as too large to be realistic, which the estimate was 14,000 ships. Voss leaned back in her chair for a moment and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her secure communicator and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first was to the UEDC Joint Chiefs. The second was to the Earth Council, which was the unified governing body of all human worlds. The third was to the Conclave Liaison Office. Within 6 hours, the data had been confirmed by 3 separate sensor networks. The signature was real. The fleet was real, and based on its heading, speed, and trajectory, it was aimed directly at the solar system. Humanity had a visitor coming. The problem was, this visitor had not sent any greetings. The Conclave Liaison, a tall, thin being from a species called the Verth, arrived at the UEDC command station the following morning. Its name was Ambassador Sear, and it had always been one of the more respectful alien diplomats in dealing with humans. It walked into the briefing room, looked at the data spread across the wall screens, and was quiet for a very long time. Then it said something that made the room go cold. It said it recognized the formation. The fleet belonged to a civilization called the Cthnar. They were an old empire, nearly 1,000 years of deep space travel behind them. They were not members of the Conclave. They had been offered membership several times and refused every time, because the Cthnar did not believe in councils or agreements. They believed in one thing only: dominance. In the past 600 years, the Cthnar had attacked and destroyed 23 civilizations. Not defeated them, not conquered and enslaved them, destroyed them. Every city, every ship, every colony, every living member of those species, gone. The Cthnar called it cataloging. They would study a species first, learn everything about them, and then eliminate them completely, keeping only their data in a massive archive aboard their flagship, E-23. 23 species extinct, cataloged. The Conclave had never stopped them, because the Cthnar were powerful enough that any direct war would cost thousands of ships and hundreds of billions of lives. So the Conclave watched and shuddered and quietly moved their own populations away from the paths the Cthnar traveled. And now the Cthnar were coming to Earth. Ambassador Sear delivered the Conclave's official recommendation with a tone that was clearly uncomfortable. The Conclave advised humanity to begin the immediate evacuation of the solar system. They would open temporary refugee corridors to 3 Conclave worlds where humans could settle while alternative arrangements were discussed. The Conclave would formally protest the Cthnar advance through diplomatic channels. The Admiral asked if those diplomatic channels had ever worked before. Ambassador Sear was quiet for a moment. Then it said, no. Voss thanked the ambassador for the information and escorted it out of the briefing room. Then she closed the door, turned to her officers, and told them to start preparing, not for evacuation, for everything else. Over the next 12 hours, the Earth Council met in emergency session. Every head of government from every human world was connected through secure channels. The meeting lasted 9 hours. There were arguments, there were moments of fear. A few voices called for the evacuation plan, saying that survival was more important than pride. But the majority did not agree, because the truth was this: if humanity ran, they would have nothing to come back to. The Cthnar did not leave things behind. They cataloged, they erased. There would be no Earth to return to, no solar system to rebuild in. The colonies and other star systems were small and fragile and could not support all of humanity permanently. Running was not survival. Running was a slower kind of extinction. And so the vote was taken. Humanity would not run. The decision was made quietly. No speeches were broadcast to the public. No dramatic declarations were sent to the Conclave. The governments of every human world simply began to move, coordinating through secure UEDC channels in ways that the wider galaxy never saw. The Conclave watched and waited for the evacuation ships to begin launching. None did. 3 days after the initial detection, a second piece of information arrived that made everything more real. One of the long-range sensor buoys in the Oort Cloud network had managed to intercept a tight-beam transmission from the Cthnar fleet. It was a short message, clearly a standard advance notice that the Cthnar sent before they arrived at any target. It had been decoded by the UEDC translation team in under 4 hours, partly because human linguists had spent years studying the few fragments of Cthnar communication that had ever been recorded. The message was simple. It said, "Earth will be cataloged, then silenced." When Voss read the decoded message, she printed it on a piece of paper, which was an odd thing to do in 2187, but she had always liked paper. She folded it in half and put it in the front pocket of her uniform jacket, where she would keep it for the next 11 months. Not out of fear, she held it out of focus, because when the hardest moments came and she knew they were coming, she wanted to be able to reach into her pocket and remember exactly what was at stake. The Cthnar fleet was still months away. At its current speed, the best estimates placed its arrival at the outer edge of the solar system at approximately 11 months and 2 weeks.
The Cthnar fleet dropped out of transit drive at 0300 hours Earth Standard Time. One moment, the outer edge of the solar system was quiet and dark. The next moment, 14,000 ships appeared from nowhere, snapping into real space with a burst of energy that lit up every sensor buoy in the Oort Cloud network. And the signal reached UEDC command station within seconds. Admiral Voss was already awake. She had been awake for 20 hours straight, working through the final preparation checks, reviewing Shepard's last round of battle models, walking the corridors of the station and speaking to her people. She had slept for 3 hours in the early part of the previous day and decided that 3 hours was enough for now. When Lieutenant Marin appeared in the doorway of the command center and said the words she had been waiting 11 months to hear, she simply nodded, set down her coffee, and walked to her station. "They're here," she said to the room. The command center went very still for 1 second. Then everyone moved at once. On the holographic table at the center of the room, the solar system map updated in real time. 14,000 contacts appeared along the outer edge, their positions marked in red, and their projected course lines stretching inward like long red fingers reaching toward the inner planets, toward Earth. Voss studied the formation for a long moment. It was textbook Cthnar. She had seen this exact spread in Shepard's historical files a dozen times. They entered in a wide fan formation, spreading their ships across a broad front so that no single defensive position could engage more than a fraction of the fleet at once. The front wave would draw fire and identify defensive emplacements. The second and third waves would overwhelm those positions. The fourth wave would advance toward the primary target. They had used this formation in 23 previous attacks. It had worked every time. Shepard had been built specifically around this formation. Voss looked at the projected approach vector. The fleet was moving at combat advance speed now, slower than their transit drive, but still fast. Based on current speed and heading, they would reach the Kuiper Belt in approximately 6 hours. She watched the red contacts on the display for another moment, making sure their formation matched what Shepard had predicted. It matched exactly. She pressed the command key that activated the Long Wall network. Deep in the Kuiper Belt, 300 Ragnarok platforms received their activation signal and began powering up from standby mode. The process was slow and careful, a design to minimize any energy signature that might be detectable. Each platform went through its startup sequence in a staggered pattern, spread across a 6-hour window, so that the gradual increase in power across the belt looked to any distant sensor like nothing more than the natural thermal variation of the frozen rock around it. Simultaneously, the Ghost Fleet received its first movement orders. 4,000 ships, already positioned along the Cthnar approach vector, began to very slowly and very carefully adjust their positions. No engine burns longer than 3 seconds, no course corrections that would produce a detectable trail. Each ship moved like a ghost, which was exactly what they were supposed to be, drifting silently into their final assigned positions. Some of those positions were inside the Cthnar formation itself. This was the most daring part of the entire plan, and it was the part that had made even Shepard's probability models look uncertain when Voss first proposed it. Over the past 9 days, 62 Ghost Fleet warships had been running dark drives and moving with extraordinary patience into the space that the Cathanar fleet was going to occupy. They had been threading through the advance a little closer every day, timing their movement to coincide with moments when the Cathanar sensor sweeps were known to be directed elsewhere. By the time the main fleet arrived, these 62 ships were already mixed in among the outer formation, invisible and waiting, at ranges so close that their weapons would be nearly impossible to miss. The Cathanar had no idea they were there. The fleet continued to advance. 6 hours passed. The red contacts on the holographic display moved steadily inward. Ambassador Sire was watching from a secure conclave monitoring station linked to the UEDC network. It had been granted observer access at the last minute, more because Voss had wanted a witness than out of any diplomatic necessity. Sire sat in front of its screens and watched the Cathanar fleet advance and watched the UEDC command center and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Conclave's diplomatic protest of the Cathanar advance had been filed. The response from the Cathanar High Command had been complete silence, as expected. Sire was watching because it needed to see what happened next, not for its government's files, for itself, because in all its years as a diplomat, it had never seen anything like what was unfolding in this room. There was fear here, yes, it could see it in the young officers, in the tight set of their jaws and the careful way they breathed. But there was something else that Sire could not name, a collective mood, a shared certainty that lay underneath the fear like bedrock under thin soil. Well, these people were not acting like a civilization facing extinction. They were acting like people who had been waiting a long time for a specific moment, and now knew it was finally here. At hours 6 and 40 minutes, the lead elements of the Cathanar fleet reached the outer boundary of the Kuiper Belt and stopped. It was only a brief stop, a standard formation check before entering a contested region. The Cathanar commanders studied their sensor readings. What they saw was the Kuiper Belt ahead of them, dark and full of rock and ice, just as their maps showed. They saw the light scatter of the outer planets far ahead. They saw the distant warm star that was Earth's sun. They did not see 300 Ragnarok platforms sitting cold and silent among the rocks. Grand Admiral Thov gave the order to advance into the Kuiper Belt. The fleet moved. For 3 more hours, 14,000 Cathanar ships pushed through the outer reaches of the solar system. This was the longest part for the humans waiting. The silence on the command deck was the kind that presses against your ears. Officers checked their stations without being asked. Nobody spoke unless they had something specific to report. Voss stood at the holographic table with her hands flat on the surface and watched the red contacts move. She watched the numbers, distance, formation, density, heading, speed. She watched and she waited, and she held the image of those 300 platforms in her mind, dark and still among the rocks, full of power that had been building for decades, waiting for one word. At hour 9 and 52 minutes, the Cathanar fleet reached the coordinate that Shepard had identified 6 months earlier. It was a point in space between the Kuiper Belt and the orbit of Neptune, where the formation density of the advancing fleet would be at its highest, and where the angles from the Ragnarok platforms were optimal for maximum coverage. Shepard had a name for it in its tactical files: the kill box. Voss looked at the display one more time. Every contact exactly where Shepard had said they would be. The Ghost Fleet invisible among and around the formation, weapons locked and ready. The Ragnarok platforms powered and aimed, waiting for the activation signal that had been pre-programmed into them since the day they were built. She pressed the open channel key for the UEDC command frequency. She said one word: Shepard. The word went out across the secure network and reached every UEDC ship and every Ragnarok platform in a fraction of a second. What happened next happened so fast and from so many directions that even the recordings would take analysts weeks to fully understand. 300 Ragnarok platforms fired simultaneously. The Kuiper Belt lit up. It did not look like a battle beginning. It looked like the edge of the solar system had caught fire. 300 mass drivers, each accelerating projectiles to 70% of the speed of light, opened fire at pre-calculated targets across the Cathanar formation. 1,000 rounds in the first second alone, moving at such a speed that by the time a Cathanar sensor registered the launch signature of a round, the round had already arrived. At the same moment, 62 Ghost Fleet ships inside the Cathanar formation dropped their dark drives and opened fire at point-blank range. Their targets were the Cathanar command ships, communications relays, and formation anchor vessels, exactly the ships that Shepard had identified as critical to the coordination of the Cathanar tactical response. From outside the formation, 4,000 Ghost Fleet ships decloaked along the approach flanks and began their attack runs. In the first 80 seconds of the engagement, 612 Cathanar vessels were destroyed or critically damaged. The Cathanar fleet, which had advanced in perfect textbook formation, suddenly had fire coming at it from 3 directions at once, including from inside its own formation, from weapons that nobody had ever told them existed, using technology that their science had not believed was possible. On the Cathanar flagship, Grand Admiral Thov received damage reports that arrived so quickly they overwhelmed his command systems. His formation was breaking. Ships were being destroyed faster than his fleet command network could track. His communications ships were gone. His sensor arrays were reading ghost signals in every direction. His advanced formation was folding as captains tried to maneuver away from fire that came from angles that made no sense. He was, for the first time in 300 years of military command, not sure what to do. He had never been ambushed before. No one had ever surprised him. Every civilization he had approached had either tried to run or had come out to fight in the open, offering their ships to be destroyed cleanly. No one had ever been inside his formation without him knowing. No one had ever had hidden weapons the size of cities sitting in an asteroid field waiting for him. For 312 seconds, Thov did nothing but absorb information and try to understand what was happening. Then,
40 ships destroyed in the first 8 seconds, then 60 more as the second wave arrived, then another 40. The Crithnar breakout attempt collapsed. Tanaka, watching from his damaged bridge, saw the red contacts on his display disappearing in clusters. He let out a breath that he had been holding for almost 40 minutes and told his remaining crew that they could stand down from full combat alert. So nobody cheered. They were too tired for that. But the tension in the room released like air from a punctured balloon, and several people leaned back in their stations and closed their eyes for a moment. The main battle continued for another 11 hours. The Crithnar fought with everything they had. There was nothing in their history that had prepared them for this. But they were not a species that surrendered easily, and Grand Admiral Tovek was not going to go quietly. Tovek tried everything his military doctrine had to offer. He attempted a concentrated breakthrough at the Ghost Fleet Northern Engagement Line, massing 300 of his heaviest warships in a single push. Shepard had modeled this exact maneuver and had pre-positioned 4 Ragnarok platforms specifically for it. The breakthrough attempt cost the Crithnar 200 ships in 20 minutes and gained them nothing. He tried dispersing his fleet into small groups, hoping to overwhelm the Ghost Fleet targeting by presenting too many individual contacts to engage at once. Shepard had modeled this too. Human ships followed individual groups with precision, and the Ragnarok platforms switched to what their targeting systems called area denial mode, filling zones of space with enough relativistic fire that nothing could move through them safely. He tried falling back, attempting to create distance from the Kuiper Belt and the mass driver fire. The Ghost Fleet followed, and when his rear formation turned to fight the pursuit, they found themselves in a crossfire between the pursuing ships and reserve Ghost Fleet units that had been waiting specifically for a retreat scenario. Shepard had modeled everything. At hour 17, Tovek had fewer than 4,000 ships left. He was being pressed from all sides. The kill box had expanded to cover nearly half the outer solar system. There was no direction he could move that didn't lead into fire. His communication network was still functional, but only barely. His heavy warships were taking damage faster than his repair crews could manage. He looked at the battle data for a very long time.
Then he did something that no Krithnar military commander had done in recorded history. He opened a communication channel to the UEDC command frequency. In the UEDC command center, after the alert for an incoming Krithnar transmission appeared on Lieutenant Marin's screen, and he stared at it for 3 full seconds before he believed it was real. Then he turned to Admiral Voss and told her. She looked at him. Then she looked at the display. Then she said to put it through. The translation came through Shepard's language system a fraction of a second after the transmission arrived, the words appearing in clear text on the main screen. To Grand Admiral Tovek, requested terms of surrender. It was a simple statement. No explanation, no context. In Krithnar language, it was a short, direct, formal declaration, and it said exactly what it needed to say in the minimum possible number of words. The Krithnar were not a species that elaborated. They said what was true and left it there. The room was silent. Nobody had known this was possible, not because they hadn't hoped for it, but because nobody had any record of the Krithnar ever having done it before. In 600 years of warfare across 23 civilizations, the Krithnar had never, not once, surrendered. Voss looked at the text on the screen for a long time. Outside, the battle was still running. Ghost Fleet ships were still in contact with the remaining Krithnar vessels. The Ragnarok platforms were still cycling. People were still fighting and dying in the dark beyond Neptune. She told the communications team to hold all offensive operations pending confirmation that the surrender request applied to the full fleet. Then she composed a response. It was short. It said that the UEDC would accept a full cessation of hostilities by the Krithnar fleet conditional on immediate weapons cold across all vessels, formation hold at current positions, and direct communication from the fleet command to all individual captains ordering compliance. That whilst non-compliance by individual ships would be treated as a continuation of hostilities. She sent it. 7 minutes later, a second message came back. Compliance order transmitted to all Krithnar fleet elements. Weapons standing cold across the outer solar system. The last exchanges of fire sputtered out like candles going dark one by one. Ghost Fleet ships held positions. Ragnarok platforms held their fire. The silence that fell over the engagement zone was the most profound silence that any human in the command center had ever heard in a battle. Marin looked at the current fleet count on his display. Of the 14,000 Krithnar ships that had entered the solar system, 9,042 had been destroyed, were critically damaged, or had lost all power. 3,100 were damaged but functional. The remaining 1,800 ships, including the flagship, were intact. All of them were holding position beyond Neptune, weapons cold, waiting for orders from their Grand Admiral. And across the galaxy, transmitted in real time through Sears' observation relay to the Conclave's main communication network, every species that had been watching the data feed saw the count. They saw how long the battle had lasted. They saw the numbers on both sides. They saw the weapons that humanity had built in secret. They saw the way the entire engagement had been designed and executed precisely according to a plan built over 40 decades. And then they saw the thing that would be talked about for generations. They saw a Krithnar Grand Admiral ask for mercy from the species he had come to silence. In the Conclave's Grand Assembly Hall, on a dozen different worlds, in trading stations, in government buildings, and military headquarters across hundreds of star systems, beings of every shape and description sat in silence in front of their information screens. Some of them had been alive for thousands of years. Some of them had watched the Krithnar destroy civilizations they knew. Some of them had told humanity to run. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Then, in a government building on a planet called Veith Prime, a Conclave senior council member, who was 900 years old and had seen more of galactic history than almost any living being, turned to the younger diplomat sitting beside her. She said one sentence. She said, "How long have they been capable of this?" The younger diplomat had no answer. Nobody in the galaxy did. In the days that followed the battle, the solar system was very quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness or defeat. It was the quiet of people who had been holding their breath for 11 months and had finally, very slowly, started to let it out. The news had reached the general public within hours of the surrender. There was no way to keep it contained. Too many people had seen the sensor feeds, too many soldiers had sent messages home, too many pieces of information had moved through channels too quickly for any government to manage. And so, in cities on Earth, on Mars, on the colony domes, in star systems, people found out in different moments, in different ways, that an alien armada had come for them and had not reached them. The reactions were different everywhere. On Earth, there were crowds in the streets. Some people cried, some people cheered. In some cities, people did nothing, just stood outside their homes and looked up at the night sky with expressions that were hard to read, as if they were seeing something familiar in a completely new way. On Mars, the colony domes lit up with every decoration their residents could find. In the asteroid belt, miners who worked in deep silence for months at a stretch held quiet gatherings in their pressurized common rooms and raised whatever they had to drink. In the outer solar system, the surviving Krithnar fleet sat in a containment zone beyond Neptune. It had been moved there in the first 3 days after the surrender, each ship guided by Ghost Fleet escorts to designated holding positions, the weapons locked, shields down, all systems running under UEDC monitoring. The Krithnar did not resist. Their ships moved where they were directed and held where they were told to hold. Whatever their feelings were about the situation, they kept those feelings to themselves. The containment zone was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no energy barriers, there were no force fields holding the ships in place. What held them there was the presence of Ghost Fleet vessels at every possible departure angle, and the knowledge, very fresh in every Krithnar officer's memory, of what the hidden weapons in the Kuiper Belt could do to a moving ship. Nobody tested it. Grand Admiral Tovek spent the first week of confinement writing reports, not for the UEDC, not for anyone who had captured him. He wrote them for the Krithnar Imperial Command, detailed and honest accounts of everything that had happened, because in his culture, recording the truth of a defeat was considered more important than the pride that wanted to soften it. His race had always believed that understanding why you lost was the only thing that made a loss worth surviving. He wrote about the weapons he hadn't known existed, the stealth technology his sensors had been completely blind to, the battle management system that had predicted his tactics with terrifying accuracy, the way the humans had fought, not like any other species he had encountered, without a clear doctrine that could be studied and countered, but with an adaptability and stubbornness that seemed to generate new responses to new problems faster than his commanders could keep up with. He wrote about the 11 destroyers. He wrote about that for a long time because it was the thing he understood least and could not stop thinking about. 11 ships charging 400. No tactical logic in it, no survival mathematics that made sense, and yet those 11 ships had bought enough time to let the platform weapons retarget, and without that time, the breakout attempt would have succeeded, and Earth's inner system would have been threatened. He wrote, "They sent 11 ships against 400, not because 11 ships can stop 400, but because someone decided that the time those 11 ships could buy was worth whatever it cost to buy it. I do not fully understand this decision. I understand the mathematics of it. I do not understand